Okay, just checking out whether the connection is properly working or not. I think it's quite really working. So, a very good evening to all of you. Hello and welcome to English Academia Crux of Understanding. This is Pratik Mahapatra, an ex-student from the Department of English, Pravat Kumar College, Kontai. There happens to be really a lot of discussion, a lot more points regarding the evolution and the progress of this particular segment of the entire program of English Academia, and the segment is, of course, as you know, known as Crux of Understanding. I initiated this subsection under the entire periphery of English Academia only in April this year as a tutorial continuation of the undergraduation syllabus, and during the last 5 months we have successfully completed at least one semester, the semester 4 under the UG syllabus of Vidyasagar University, and now recently the journey of the 5th semester has been started. Now those who are acquainted with my Teachmint platform website, namely English Academia 21.teachmint.int, maybe a little bit maybe wondering a little bit, since this is altogether a differentiated kind of presentation, a different kind of recording. I am recording from home instead of my regular basis of live class discussion. So this happens to be a lecture on the notion of post-colonial literature and the journey of Commonwealth nation as well as Commonwealth literature. Now, as you know, those who are closely acquainted with the UG syllabus of Vidyasagar University, they are quite familiar with the pattern of the current UG syllabus of English literature, while erstwhile during our period of undergraduate course there happened to be a primary emphasis on the module of British literature, and by the end of the course there used to be the tinge of American literature and a bit of Indian writing in English by selecting a few iconic authors and their cult texts. The current undergraduation syllabus, by contrast, is really a huge one, making all the students enable in the context of the bigger competitive examinations such as the National Eligibility Test, NTA UGC NET, and of course the state level eligibility test, or SET, of course. And alongside having a basic emphasis on the British module of literary evolution, there are a few handful texts of American literature. We will be encountering a few more cult texts of the iconic authors in the module of Indian writing in English, and I'm extremely thankful to the university, to the authority who have eventually set up the current gesture of the syllabus for adding the post-colonial literature as a module, for including women writing, as well as the 19th century European realism, and of course a bit of world literature. Now, one thing is quite interesting. I have told my students who are enrolled in my batch that up to their journey of 3rd semester, they so far had witnessed a kind of syllabus pattern which happened to be quite familiar with our time during our undergraduate course, of course, because the British module, the American module, and the Indian writing in English, these 3 basic modules happen to be there. And now, when they are to start their journey from 4th semester onwards, there are the new inclusions in the form of the new modules, such as in the 3 papers deliberated under the curriculum of the 4th semester. There are a handful of modern European dramas, including Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, including Henrik Ibsen's Ghost. One is definitely belonging to the genre of absurd theater, while the another one, on the other hand, is of course a chiefly or conspicuous belonging agent of the realistic play or the propaganda plays. And of course, there is Bertolt Brecht's cult text, that the good person of Sezua. So three differentiated kinds of plays are included over there in the CC9. That means the core paper 9 under the curriculum of fourth semester. And of course, there are the introductory notions of classical literature. We have had Homer's Iliad Book 1 in particular. We have got the cult classical tragedy Oedipus Rex or Oedipus Tyrannus by Sophocles. We have got a few selections from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and there is the inclusion of Plautus's The Pot of Gold. Now, and of course, the last paper designates all about the notion of popular literature, incorporating a world-class widespread readers from differentiated genres of interest, as varied as the detective fiction, the nonsense fiction, and the children literature, of course. So I'm not going into further depth of the semester 4 curriculum, of course, because this presentation is primarily meant to be a deliberation on post-colonial literature. So just to have a sort of introduction, I just mentioned the varied pattern of the syllabus that the current UG batch is witnessing. Now, whenever we are entering to the realm of post-colonial literature, or prior to that, post-colonialism in particular, this one thing that is quite interesting, that post-colonialism, as it is developed during the 1980s, conspicuously with the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism back in 1978. After 1980s onwards, it happened to acquire and conquer, of course, a number of differentiated genres as varied as geography, history, political science, and the other branches of social studies, alongside the other fields of inquiries. So, whenever one comes to the plethora of post-colonialism, one literally finds himself in such kind of differentiated or diverse genres of interest. And English literature happened to be, it just happens to be one of the ways of expression, so to say. So whenever we begin our discussion with discussion on post-colonialism, I've already deliberated one lecture on day 1, that means on Wednesday in my batch. But since today's lecture happened to be lost, I don't know how this was happened in the teachment platform. I should have been more careful, I think. So, to begin with the notion of post-colonialism, we must understand that there are the conjugation of the two words. Of course, at the very base, at the very root, is the word colonialism or colony, and it is backed up by a prefix called post. Now, from a surface level or a level, depending upon a level of denotation, we really know that post-colonialism, when it is written with its hyphenated designation, hyphenated differentiation between the two words, the prefix post and the root words colonialism, it is literally designating a time, basically a political scenario after getting rid of the clutch of British rule as judged from the Indian context. And whenever it is being written without the hyphenated form, it is much more connotative, since it is not really just denoting a temporal frame, rather it's connoting the entire socio-political, cultural and economical impacts both on the colonized province and of course on the province who eventually represented themselves to be the colonizers. Now, this is just a rudimentary idea regarding the two written forms of expression. One, postcolonialism with the hyphenated version, and another version is, of course, without the hyphen. So, judging from the Indian context, if we just take the temporal frame, post colonialism, when it is written with the hyphenated expression, it really designates the time when India got free from the British Raj, from the clutch of the British colonialism on 15th of August 1947. But that just happens to be one side of the coin. It is often said that post colonialism is literally commenced as a journey with the advent of colonialism. So, whenever we are uttering such an expression, such a connotation, we must be careful regarding the entire issue of the expansionistic politics or propaganda of the plethora of post colonialism. As we know, the very root word colony actually has derived its current form from the rudimentary Latin word colonia, which happens to designate the gifted lands, the lands which were owned by the certain soldiers. And those lands during the time of the Roman Empire was awarded to the soldiers as the reward of winning the battle. The only condition over there on part of the Roman Empire that was bestowed upon the victorious soldiers, that they had to retain the Roman political and cultural, if we just say it in the mold of an umbrella term, the Roman colonial interest had to be retained upon those gained provinces, so to say. So, in that context, the Roman Empire, the then Roman Empire, really happened to be the conqueror of a vast amount of provinces, if we take the then scenario of the world map. This morning I was presenting a diagram, a world map designating the Eurocentric post-colonial, Eurocentric colonial tendency, which happened to encompass a number of provinces from Canada, from North America. There are a number of African countries, the West Indies island, India in its undivided form, of course, the East Indies island, and the almost the entire whole of Australia. So that happened to be the Eurocentric notion of colonized province back in 1921. That was one map which I would be presenting in one of my subsequent presentations, of course. And only after that I presented the present day notion of the Commonwealth nation. So, in order to quickly wrap up the entire session of today's discussion, which happened to be lost from the Teachment platform, causing too much worry to me, the Eurocentric expansionistic tendency of colonizing the provinces just got its advantage, the state of advancement, back in the 14th and the 15th century as a point of genesis, when several new provinces were being discovered. Now that happened to be the genesis, the evolution, or the point of commencement, we may term, and it really attained its peak or climax just during the time of industrial revolution in the late 18th and early 19th century, because the Eurocentric colonial tendency, of course, really preoccupies a great notion of capitalistic tendency, because whenever the advent of industrial revolution is preoccupying the entire whole of socio-political and economical scenario, we know that the task performed by the machines really reduced a lot of human physical labor. And now when the surplus product is being increased in terms of their amounts, they needed to be sold in a free market, and market really needed to be widened if one particular nation or one particular mercantile agent has to expand its own business interest or commercial interest. There are two techniques of getting a vast amount of munafa, vast amount of what can I say, advancement in terms of commercial benefit. One, either cutting down the selling price or the market price of the product that is being produced in a particular in a particular nation or in a particular province, or if that happened to be a kind of a kind of blot on the development, the entire captivated market had really to be widened so that a number of other consumers may be included in the entire scenario of the mercantile genre. So with this tendency, when the Eurocentric colonial advancement performed by Britain was getting its gradual progression, there happened to be a number of other provinces belonging to the other continents. They just represented themselves as the steady provider of, just a minute, okay, they just happened to be the steady provider of the raw materials um, for the sake of the European countries. And not only they just did not retain those provinces to be the only provider of the raw materials. Rather, by captivating their markets, the business interest was gradually turning out to be a kind of political subjugation as well. And with the advent of political subjugation, there came, of course, the advancement of the cultural, economical, and social subjugation, gradually, bit by bit, blow by blow. So, when such kind of capitalistic tendency were being endowed, it was now when we are roughly rounded up the notion of the correlation between uh, the colonial tendency attained by Britain and the capitalistic mode of investment, we may really understand the whereabouts of the colonial genesis and their expansion. In the plethora of post-colonialism, there lies two predominant yardsticks. You know, one is of course the post-colonial literature, the literary outputs of the colonized, erstwhile colonized province, and another one is definitely the colonial discourse analysis, the deliberation on the power structure. Alongside these two predominant yardsticks or the benchmarks, of course, there comes the notion of the process of decolonization. We will be discussing the entire issue in a gradual manner, of course, but just let us sum up the, because as I can see here, the timer is really running out too quickly. So in order to complete today's discussion only, there are a few certain points which really needs a great amount of emphasis. Whenever the discourse of the colonialism is being discussed amidst us, or a discussion is being performed, being attended by the students of the literature, English literature and humanities, one thing must be understood, that in terms of provincial designation, there are two certain points. One is metropolis, the mother country, who happened to be the conqueror, the colonizers of the other provinces, and there are the notions of peripheries. And what are those peripheries? Peripheries are but the colonized provinces. So in case of India, in case of our Indian colonial structure, so to say, India happened to be serving as a peripheral country to the British Empire up to the 15th of August 1947, and only after the date, of course, the India got itself free from the political subjugation, but it is still bearing a number of colonial legacies of the British Empire, and it is not only deep rooted on the basis of some of the day to day or mundane affairs of our socio cultural life, but it is also highly influential in the context of the constitution of the Indian subcontinent also, because there happen to be a number of incorporation from the British constitution in case of the formation of the Indian constitution, because that is also a part of the legacy bearing attitude of the colonial tendencies. Okay, so we are still bearing the colonial legacies to a greater extent. Now, the formation of the Commonwealth nation happened to be taking place in the year 1964, much before the arrival or the coinage of the term post-colonialism, and it took place with the International Commonwealth Conference organized by the University of Leeds, where a number of nations happened to be grouped together under the umbrella term of Union of Crown, later known and rebranded as the Commonwealth nation, since they were bearing a certain kind of mutual past in terms of bearing colonial legacies. But when the notion of Commonwealth literature come, it was widely defined that all the literary outputs which were written in English coming from those nations, they happened to be the representative entities of Commonwealth literature conspicuously belonging to those provinces which were erstwhile conquered by the British Empire. Now, one thing is quite interesting that with the advent of the much later generation writers and with the progression of the time, the term Commonwealth literature literally was getting a kind of peripheral attitude. We know at its base that with the advent of post-colonialism, there happened to be a far more greater emphasis, far more large and greater emphasis on the little narratives, just keeping aside the notion of meta narrative or grand narrative. That means instead of taking a larger account of the British literature, the provincial literature was getting a kind of upper hand. Clear up to this point? So, when the propaganda of Commonwealth literature was being unraveled with the advent of time, with the advancement of time, so to say, one thing was quite clear that there were a number of loopholes in the concept of Commonwealth literature. First of all, although Britain very much happens to be one of the states, member states of the Commonwealth nation, the British literature, bearing all its royalties and the great ancient lineage, the lineage of blue blood, of course, it never really designated under the umbrella term of Commonwealth literature. Point number two is definitely the notion of America. Whenever we discuss the flavor of and pros and cons of American literature, we literally tend to term it only as the American literature, not a part of Commonwealth literature. We know that every year on the 4th of July, America happens to celebrate its Independence Day, which was eventually just engraved a milestone back in 1776. So, Britain happens to be excluded from the notion of Commonwealth nation, and British literature is definitely a legacy-bearing agent of in their own right, in its own right, and with that phenomenon on one hand, and America excluded from the concept of the Commonwealth nation on the other countries really started to raise protests against the existence of such a term called Commonwealth literature. Now, It was for Salman Rushdie, the India-born novelist of the modern age, happened to be one of those pioneers who first just did deliver a blow on the concept of the Commonwealth literature. Now, alongside the situational state of Britain and America, the Commonwealth literature basically concentrated on the English literary outputs of the colonized provinces. But in case of the colonial provinces, the English literary outputs were basically the translations. Whenever we discuss the novels of Chinua Achebe or Ngugi wa Thiong'o, or just take the example of one of the renowned Bengali writers, Mahashweta Devi, Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak happens to be the English translator of Mahashweta Devi's text. Those literature, those cult texts happen to be written in their regional language first, at the very first place, and then it gradually got translated by the literary scholars. So the notion of Commonwealth literature really did not take the account of the regional languages and put a primary emphasis on the English output, the English literary output of those erstwhile colonized provinces. And of course, whenever the regional expression of the literature is being taken into account, of course, there happens to be a great deal of the regional languages also. So, Commonwealth literature literally disagreed or overlooked the notion of the regional languages to a vast extent. By the time already the decade of late 1970s, early 1980s had happened, and we know that post-colonialism as a term, with the publication of Orientalism by Edward Said, got its real advancement. And the writers belonging to the contemporary generation had really faced a number of other traumas as well. There happens to be a great deal of discussion regarding the diasporic literature, the internationally greater amounts of immigration, and the trauma of partition, judging upon the point of Indian context. So, the Commonwealth literature, as it primarily expects one writer to be the conspicuous deliberator of the particular province, really overlooked and disagreed all these notions of cross-cultural affairs, territorial border disputes, and the immigrational issues. So, judging upon all those points, post-colonial literature happens to be quite a wider term than Commonwealth literature. I can clearly remember in a paper 303 under PG semester 3, under the syllabus of Vidyashakar University, there lies two sections. One is Commonwealth post-colonial studies, of course, incorporating the post-colonial theories deliberated by Frantz Fanon, Bill Ashcroft, Rabindranath Tagore, and there happens to be a few cult texts such as A Passage to India by E.M. Forster, some poetry of Derek Walcott or A.D. Hope, so to say. And alongside this 303, there happens to be 305, incorporating a few more writers such as V.S. Naipaul, Judith Wright, and the others from differentiated provinces. And that paper is entitled as Commonwealth Literature. Now, I really don't know why such kind of this sort of old standard designation has been made on part of the authority, but nevertheless, when I happen to teach this kind of section, one special paper is there under graduation semester 5, it's under the title of World Literature, and to my surprise, most of the Commonwealth writers, judging from the then point of view, most of the Commonwealth writers like Judith Wright, V.S. Naipaul, such authors were included under this paper title called World Literature. So I think this is basically one of the replicas that reflects on the UG syllabus, taking the essence from the present PG syllabus. Of course, I don't know up to which point it would exist, because from time to time number of proposals have been heard. But just keeping all those aside, in our time, and the still syllabus is still going on, there happen to be two papers, one on post-colonial literature and another on Commonwealth literature. But judging from the current context of the acceptability of the term, post-colonial literature really incorporates all the regional languages, the expression of the regional languages being backed up by the strong notion of decolonizing tendency. Whereas, on the other hand, in case of Commonwealth literature, alongside having a basic disagreement or overlooking tendency of the regional languages or regional expressions, there happened to be a great deal of the retaining gesture of the erstwhile colonial legacies, colonial tendencies. So, in this point, the two stances are getting its diverged notion of expression. While Commonwealth literature was conspicuously the belonging agent of the colonial tendencies, a retaining gesture, overlooking the flavor of the provincial languages and expressions, post-colonial literature, on the other hand, definitely incorporates a strong notion of decolonial methods and outcomes. And of course, there happens to be a great deal of acceptance in the regional languages. In fact, much before the publication of Side's Orientalism, with the publication and advancement of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth and his Black Skin, White Mask, there happened to be a real milestone of the entire plethora of post-colonial literature. In our coming days, only after the completion of the upcoming exam of UG Semester 5, we will be having a lot more discussion on the issues on post-colonial literature and their literary outputs. I would suggest the students to go between some of the great lines regarding the colonial discourse analysis as I have suggested them. I will be making different presentations on them, which would be eventually available in our platform of English Academia here on YouTube. So this presentation happened to be just a short summing up of this morning's lecture on the notion of post-colonialism and the Commonwealth literature. I sincerely thank you all for providing me with this kind of support, and just be on the trail of learning and always keep enhancing yourselves. We will be meeting soon with the different issue on Commonwealth literature on our current trail of the journey of the 5th semester. Thank you.